Hello and welcome to The Briefing, a weekly conversation with leaders and experts to explore the ideas shaping our democracy today. I'm Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center, and it is an extraordinary time to be having this conversation. When you go to the National Archives, you walk in and it is like a religious experience. People are hushed, they're waiting online, they're looking at objects, documents behind thick glass. That's the Constitution of the United States. It plays a role in our country unlike the Constitution or the founding documents of almost any other country. It's extraordinarily important, even now, but it is much more than words scratched on parchment. It still lives on now, and we're still debating, what does the Constitution mean? Is its meaning frozen? Is it a living document? How should we understand the Constitution? How can we make sure that we're living up to it? We hear all the time things are constitutional or unconstitutional. I demand my rights. I plead the fifth. It's very much a part of our lives. And the thing we think at the Brennan Center to understand is this is not a document just for judges or justices or lawyers or even law professors. It's for all of us to understand. And we are very lucky to that end to have a new book by one of the country's leading constitutional scholars and communicators, Professor Melissa Murray.
Thank you.
The book is really terrific. It is called The U.S. Constitution, a Comprehensive and Annotated Guide for the Modern Reader. It will blow your mind in many ways. It is the Constitution with commentary. Melissa's co-author is James Madison. And
he would be very surprised to learn that.
Very surprised.
I think James Madison would be like, who taught her to read and write?
But we're going to talk about the book, about the Constitution, about what's going on in our country at this intense moment. And as I said, we're going to be hearing questions. And I should say I'm very excited because the very first time I was in this building, I was in high school and I snuck into a rock concert. And this is even more exciting. So we will try to bring down the house, and if they lift up lighters, then we'll know we've done a good job.
Before we do that, can I say thank you to the Brennan Center for hosting this on Publication Day. It is one of the privileges of my life to teach at NYU Law, where I've had the pleasure of teaching amazing law students, working with fantastic law students and colleagues. And what makes it even better is that the Brennan Center is housed at NYU Law, and I have amazing colleagues through the Brennan Center as well. So it is such a delight and seems so fitting to launch this project here with you today, Michael. So thank you.
That's very kind. And this is the day of the book launch. And that's a very big day. And I should mention also, as I'm sure so many of you know, in addition to being a professor of constitutional law at NYU, Melissa is the co-host of Strict Scrutiny, the legal podcast that teaches all of us every day about the Constitution, and we are really lucky. So the first question I have for you is, there are other annotated constitutions. Why this one, and why when you can get a constitution for free and it even fits in your pocket? What's the thinking behind doing this book?
So I'll tell you the origin story of this book. And yes, there are other annotated constitutions. You can get a free constitution from Westlaw or whatever. But the reason I decided to write this book was about 3 years ago, I was in the Twitter streets. Do you remember when Twitter was great? Yes, it was so much fun to be on Twitter. And I was in those Twitter streets all the time. And one day I was on Twitter, and someone that I knew from my childhood, he was a public figure. His name is Luther Campbell. Does anyone know who Luther Campbell is? Uncle Luke from Two Live Crew. If you're from the South, yes, a rapper, Uncle Luke from Two Live Crew. He was on Twitter, And he's really going in on Joe Biden, who was the president of the United States. And, he had a litany of things that Joe Biden needed to do, things Joe Biden should do. Joe Biden should bring down the price of gas. Joe Biden should deal with healthcare. Joe Biden should do this. Joe Biden should deal with police brutality. I mean, it was a really long list. It was like a thread almost on Twitter. And as I was reading it, I realized about half of the things that Luke was talking about, Joe Biden couldn't do because the president isn't authorized to do that. Other people may be able to do that. Congress could do it. A mayor might be able to do it of a locality. And it occurred to me that Uncle Luke probably had not read the Constitution. And then I began thinking, I wonder if anyone has read the Constitution. When I assigned the Constitution on the first day of constitutional law, and I think it may be the first time some of my students have read the entire document front to back. And I'm not even sure if they've read it front to back, let's be honest. But we should, right? The reason why the whole Constitution can fit in your pocket is because the framers did not put everything in. They weren't as comprehensive as they could have been because they wanted it to be read, right? John Marshall talks about this. If we had enumerated everything, it would have the prolixity of a code. And who would read it? And the whole point of this written Constitution, framing a government for, of, and by the people, was that the people had to be engaged. And so I wrote this, and I decided to annotate it in a particular way to make it accessible. This isn't for law students. It's not for law professors. Larry Tribe read it, and he's like, Melissa, you should. I'm like, it's not for you. It's not for you. You're not the audience for this. And he's very gracious about it. But this is a book that every American should be able to read and find accessible and be able to find their place in our constitutional order within it.
I noted in the dedication that you dedicated this to your parents and to your children. Why did you do that? Was there something special about that?
So my parents were Jamaican immigrants who came to this country. My father came here just after finishing high school in Jamaica to attend Howard University, where he stayed on for dental school before joining the Army, and being in the Army was his conduit to citizenship. My mother came here on a visa program for nurses in the 1960s when there was a shortage of nurses in the country. I wanted to dedicate it to my parents because they have been the most profound influence on me, and it seemed especially important at a time when so many in our country are questioning the value that immigrants bring to this country, that we affirm that immigrants are part of the fabric of our country, they add to the beauty and richness of our country, and they are Americans too. And then I dedicated it to my children, and the inscription is, "This land is your land." Because my children are not just the grandchildren of immigrants, they are also the grandchildren of individuals who were once enslaved. And I don't want to forget that either. This land is our land too.
And there's an intensity of belief in the system often among immigrants, among people who've had to fight for their rights, or who have had ancestors or are part of their own personal stream of tradition, who know what it takes to get a multiracial democracy.
There is no more fervent proselytizer than the converted. I mean, truly. My mother became a citizen later in life, but she believes so deeply in the promise of America because I think she looked at the life I was living and recognized it would not have been possible anywhere else. I mean, she was born to a woman who was married at 17 and had 7 children in quick succession. Like by the time my grandmother was 30, she had 7 kids. She did not finish high school because no one thought it was necessary to educate women beyond elementary school because all you needed was enough education to run your household and write correspondence for your husband, if that was necessary. The idea that you would have a granddaughter who would go to Yale Law School and clerk for a judge and then become a law professor, my grandmother would not have imagined that. And my mother saw it happen, and she knew it was possible only because of this country.
It's one of the things that is so infuriating to me, and I'll make a list, about what J.D. Vance has been saying, which is that he says America is not an idea. it's not a creedal nation, that it's basically a plot of land with a bunch of people on it. He means white people, I think, and that you really can't be as fully American as his ancestors unless, as he said in one of his major speeches, unless you're buried in the hillside in Kentucky. And to me, and as this book shows, and as your story shows, that's the precise opposite of the actual way we've built this country toward what it could be. And the experience of almost everybody in the country actually belies that.
So this whole narrative about, I think, what J.D. Vance calls heritage Americans is so offensive. I mean, it's the only heritage Americans are Native Americans. We should start there. The rest of us came on some kind of boat or passenger vehicle, whether by force or voluntarily. We've all worked together to create this country. This country belongs to all of us. And part of reclaiming the promise of this country for all of us is to actually engage with how this country is scaffolded, the institutions that give life to our government and that scaffold our lives, and recognizing that the Constitution at bottom is a document about limited government. It is about restraints on the government. Even initially, they weren't actually thinking about rights. The rights came later. Their first and principal concern was how to limit government. I talk about the Constitution as a trauma-informed document, and it was. These were people who had lived through the colonial period where the British Crown and the British Parliament were literally on their necks constantly, levying taxes, making it impossible for them to criticize the government because of taxes on paper and ink and printing presses, all of the things. And they chafed under it. So they're dealing with that trauma, the trauma of literally having a government that is so powerful that it is oppressive. And then they have another trauma. They declare their independence and they have to go to war against the greatest global superpower the world had ever seen. And they're literally trying to do this with 13 militias loosely coordinated in a government that is linked together by Scotch tape and friendship bracelets. It is the dumbest thing in the world. And they're traumatized by that too. So when they sit down to journal through it, and that is what the Constitution is, they're working through it, they're trying to strike this balance. How can we have a government that is efficient and effective and does things, but isn't so efficient and effective that it becomes despotic? That's what that's the balance they're trying to strike. And we need to think about that. They so feared the prospect of a government that was too powerful. They were so preoccupied with this idea that the government could have a standing army because they'd seen it firsthand. They saw the British Crown send redcoats into their cities to terrorize the colonists. And they didn't want that for themselves. So when they recognized, yes, we have to have a standing army, they divided control over it. So Congress gets to fund it. Congress assembles it. Congress decides how to train it. And the president is the commander-in-chief. They did not want to consolidate it in one single branch because that was the way to tyranny, and they knew it. Why aren't we talking about that as we watch military forces descend on cities all over this country?
It is so striking when you read the details of the mechanical workings built into the Constitution, how preoccupied they were with this very issue. They say that appropriations for the military can only last 2 years because that way there could be an intervening election.
Right.
And people could throw the bums out if they voted for a tyrannical military force.
They were so preoccupied with the prospect of a standing army. And this translates into the Bill of Rights. The Second Amendment, I don't know who needs to hear this. The militia clause is not mere surplusage. It's not superfluous. They wanted a militia in the event the standing army that the federal government controlled became tyrannical. They were also deeply concerned in the South that there might be a Congress with abolitionist leanings, and if there was a slave uprising, they wouldn't send the standing army or the militia into the states to quell any slave uprisings. So they wanted to be able to keep and bear arms so they could do it themselves. They could form immediate militias to be able to do that. But again, so much of this is about this preoccupation with a federal government that can have armed forces.
Do you think of the Constitution as a counter-revolutionary document at the time? They were coming out of, as you said, this trauma of the Revolutionary War, which had far more people killed, given how small they were, than any other American war except the Civil War. And they'd had sort of a failed state under the Articles of Confederation. There's a book, as you know, called The Founders' Coup. It was actually to rein in the democratic tendencies versus the idea that it was actually the seed of the building of American democracy. I mean, people like Frederick Douglass changed their views of this. He started out calling the Constitution a covenant with death and ended by saying it was actually an anti-slavery document and a pro-democracy document. Do you have a view, having dove into it as you have?
There are 3 or 4 constitutions in here, and that's the first thing we should wrestle with. I think we fetishize the original Constitution, and we fetishize the original framers. We know them, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, on and on and on. That's not the only moment that matters as a matter of constitutional meaning. You know, there is the framing, and it's imperfect. It's imperfect from the start, right? People like George Mason and Patrick Henry are like, wait a minute, your whole idea for preventing tyranny is to divide the government horizontally and vertically? Like, be so for real, friends. They want a Bill of Rights. And so they want explicit protections for individual rights. From the start, it's found to be inadequate. And it's immediately amended to include these explicit protections for individual rights against the federal government. They also recognize, there are critics among them who recognize that it's an incredibly elitist document as initially framed. They are deeply concerned, as you say, with the prospect of popular participation in the democracy. It's fine for the House of Representatives. They allow the House of Representatives to be subject to the popular will. They are not willing to let the Senate be popularly elected. The upper chamber serves for a longer period of time, 6 years, and initially it was elected by state legislatures. They selected the senators because they feared having a House of Representatives, a Congress with the Senate that also was popularly elected. The Electoral College belies their distrust of the people. So, this is not a perfect democratic document as first conceived, but it has the seeds and the mechanisms for becoming more perfect over time. And Frederick Douglass made this clear. The original Constitution is not just accommodating slavery, it's rife with references to slavery, not explicit. Slavery is never mentioned in the original Constitution, but anytime you see the year 1808 in the original Constitution, it's about slavery. Why? Because the Constitution is being ratified in 1788, and one of the compromises that they are striking with the South is to give the Southerners 20 years to do slavery, and then they're going to stop the importation of slaves through the transatlantic slave trade. That is in Article 1. And their idea is that if we just give them 20 years, it's almost like a halfway house for enslavement. If we give them 20 years to work it out, by the time we get to the end of 20 years, the South will be self-sufficient. They won't need slavery anymore. We won't need to import slaves any longer. When 1808 comes around, Congress passes a law to end the transatlantic slave trade, but the South doesn't end its dependence on this peculiar institution. Instead, it simply shifts to a self-reproducing slave population. And the sectional crisis that precipitates is what ultimately leads to a second founding moment, the post-war Reconstruction Amendments, where they recognize they have to repair a country that has been utterly riven and broken. And repairing it means not simply going back to what we had, but starting afresh and renegotiating the relationship between the federal government and the states and between the federal government, the states, and the people. And that is what we get principally in the 14th Amendment, but also in the 15th Amendment.
And you've made the point that there are unsung heroes in the crafting of the Constitution over the decades. We know about the guys in the powdered wigs, but people don't know the name of the principal author of the 14th Amendment, which was the second founding.
We should ask ourselves that question. Why don't we know who John Bingham is? Like, why isn't Ken Burns and Daniel Day-Lewis doing stuff about John Bingham?
We have him right here.
Lyman Trumbull, Thaddeus Stevens. You know, we are living in a moment right now where anything that talks about slavery is condemned and denounced as critical race theory or impermissible DEI. Ask yourselves, why? Like, why are we afraid to talk about this history? Why are we afraid to talk about this moment where these radical Republicans in Congress advanced a different vision of what this country should be? Why don't we talk about them in the same way? We don't talk about the 14th Amendment the way we talk about the First Amendment, but it is as consequential, maybe more so, than the First Amendment. What are we afraid of? I think we're afraid of the fact that the Reconstruction Amendments are meant to fundamentally alter the DNA of this Constitution and this country, and we don't want to grapple with that.
It was a second founding, and it superseded the first founding. Mm-hmm. And over and over again, 40% of the words in the Constitution now were written after the original Constitution through the process of amendments. And the 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment, of course, are so central. Without them, we wouldn't have the Bill of Rights a part of all of our lives in any meaningful way. But then there were other ways. Over and over again, these were to expand democracy and expand the ability of the people to control the government. One of the unsung heroes, heroines of this fight has an NYU law school connection. Inez Milholland was one of the principal leaders of the drive for the 19th Amendment. And people kind of skip over that. Well, women were given the right to vote, but they had to fight for the right to vote. And you write about that also in describing that.
So again, it's always great to sing the praises of NYU Law. NYU Law was educating women as lawyers well before our peer schools were doing so, and the women who NYU educated literally changed the Constitution in this country. So first wave feminists were desperately trying to be read into the Constitution. The Constitution also doesn't say anything about women. When the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were being written, Abigail Adams was writing to her husband John, asking him, "Remember the ladies?" And he was like, "Who? Who?" They don't remember the ladies. And she has that wonderful phrase, all husbands would be tyrants if they could. Right? So she recognizes that the law offers no safe harbor for women, and she wants the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, to remember them too. When the 14th Amendment is ratified, first wave feminists who are very closely allied with the abolitionist movement really, really want to be read into it, right? They want the terms of the 14th Amendment not just to apply in the context of race and race discrimination, but also in the context of gender discrimination. They are making claims that marriage is a species of slavery, that it too, like the husband-wife relationship, is a domestic relation of subordination and domination, both legally and practically, and they want to be read into it. They fail at that project. Right? Women are not included. The Supreme Court puts the kibosh on reading the 14th Amendment through the lens of gender, at least in the context of voting in Minor versus Happersett. And the women's rights movement does not give up. They just shift gears. So they decide what they really need to do if they're going to be successful is they need to be able to vote. If the 14th Amendment won't give them the right to vote, they are going to do it another way. So they immediately pivot to states, right? So they're going to launch a campaign to get state legislatures to enfranchise women at the state level. And this is a lesson for us today about working on two fronts. And then they continue prosecuting this campaign for a constitutional amendment to the federal Constitution that will enfranchise women. They are initially far more successful on the state level, but those state level successes are not just buoying, they eventually cede the fight for what becomes the 19th Amendment, which is ratified in 1920 after hunger strikes and parades and brutal beatings at the hands of authorities. I mean, like, this was a struggle in every possible way. Ultimately, Tennessee becomes the final state to ratify the 19th Amendment, and it is because a state legislator in Tennessee who was not feeling warmly inclined toward ratification received a letter from his mother. And she advised him to be a good boy and vote for the women's suffrage amendment. And so he did, and Tennessee became the last state. But I mean,
by one vote.
By one vote. This is all to say that institutions are important, universities are important, individual people refusing to take it anymore are important, and letters from your mother are really important. All of this creates constitutional change.
And then he had to go hide in the attic of the state capitol because a mob of fellow men were chasing him for having done this. So it's much more lively than you might think to understand.
So many good stories. So many.
It's full of good stories. You made the point, and the 19th Amendment, of course, was part of it, that we actually don't understand as well as we might the period at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, from the Gilded Age of extraordinary inequality and class conflict and corruption, and then the Progressive Era, as it was known, that came after, which included quite a few innovations in government, creating government agencies, but also constitutional amendments.
So the Gilded Age period is a really fertile time of constitutional change, one that we actually don't talk about a lot, which is really unfortunate because it's a period of constitutional change that's almost entirely popularly driven. My research assistant, Sam Ozer-Staten, who worked on this section with me, was like, we had terrific conversations about how much this period reminded us of right now. I mean, this was a period, late 19th, early 20th century, the rise of industry, the consolidation of wealth in the hands of a few. The oligarchy has risen in the United States, and working class people are done with it. They are tired of the rampant income inequality, and they are especially tired of the fact that the federal government's principal means of raising revenue is tariffs. They hate tariffs. Why do they hate tariffs? Because tariffs are like taxes, except they're regressive, and they're disproportionately borne by the working classes. What do they want? They want a progressive income tax so the rich can pay their fair share. Why can't they get it? Article 1 of the Constitution has a provision that prevents Congress from levying a direct tax. And the Supreme Court has determined in a case from that period that a direct income tax would violate that provision of Article 1. And so rather than taking it and, paying their tariffs, they decide to go to work and they start agitating and they build popular support for a progressive income tax, and ultimately the 16th Amendment is adopted, and that's the roots of our income tax today, and the people did that. And then they turn right around with the 17th Amendment and start asking questions. Why should state legislatures elect senators? Like, why aren't we doing that in the same way that we elect representatives to the House of Representatives, and they get the 17th Amendment? The people have a little bit of a bump in the road with the 18th Amendment. That's prohibition. Cinco de Mayo. They think better of it with the 21st Amendment, but then they're right back on their hustle with the 19th Amendment, which again is born of popular unrest, women refusing to be disenfranchised. And it results in literally the largest expansion of the American electorate in the history of this country.
And the 17th Amendment was their version of campaign finance reform.
Yes.
Because in the pre-Citizens United era, the big money from the trusts and the robber barons were buying state legislatures. And so they thought that the legislatures were particularly corrupt, that the copper industry owned the Montana legislature and so on. And giving the people the vote was consciously, explicitly designed to tamp down the role of big money in politics. And you mentioned the Supreme Court, and it's really notable that we haven't really mentioned it up until now. And that's it. We're done with them. No.
Would that's all it took.
As you know, we're having this conversation just a week after the Supreme Court destroyed what was left of the Voting Rights Act in the Calais case. It was an extraordinarily misguided decision, I believe, we believe. Everything that is wrong with American politics, it makes worse. It literally says that the way to defend against even a well-proved case of racial discrimination in drawing of district lines, it was about redistricting, is for a legislature to say, oh, no. This was just partisan gerrymandering. We weren't trying to hurt minority voters. We were just trying to hurt Democrats or Republicans. And then it's case closed. And that's literally the rationale that's used. So the question I have is, did the Constitution envision the role that the Supreme Court now plays in our society? And do you think that they are handling that role as well as they should?
So if you look at the Constitution, you kind of get a sense of what they were really preoccupied with, at least in the original Constitution. Article 1 is so long. I remember when I was reading the audiobook, I was like, damn, we're still on Article 1? Wow. Like, there's a lot in there. Article 2, not as lengthy as Article 1, and therein lies some of the problems. Yeah, like they probably could have done a little bit more to be complete on Article 2. Article 3 really does feel like an afterthought. Alexander Hamilton says this, the judiciary is the least dangerous branch. They're not imagining that the court will play the same role, in part because it really hasn't in their lives. The trauma they're responding to in the Constitution is the work of the British Crown, King George III, and the work of the Parliament. They're not thinking about the judiciary as much. If they are, it's really the Star Chamber that's an arm of the Crown. And, they have lots of provisions in the original Constitution against bills of attainder and, the whole prospect of the Bill of Rights and these, a right to a trial by jury is about the Star Chamber and this idea that you could just literally be thrown into prison by an inquisitorial kind of tribunal. But they're not that concerned about the judiciary. And really, the role that the court plays today is the result of a monumental power grab by John Marshall in Marbury versus Madison in 1803, where he seizes for the judiciary the authority to say what the law is, the power of judicial review. And he basically says, what's the point of a written constitution? Why would we take the time to write things down and limit the government if we weren't going to have a branch that enforces it? So yes, Congress has the power of the purse and the president has the power of the sword. We have the power to read, and we're going to read this document and figure out when you get it wrong and when you get it right. I tell my students in constitutional law, after he writes Marbury versus Madison, I'm 100% sure John Marshall goes back to his chambers and strokes a hairless cat for a half an hour. It's the biggest power grab in history. So no, they weren't, I don't think they were envisioning that. I don't think they were imagining the role that the court would play in shaping constitutional meaning, both for good and for ill. And Louisiana versus Calais, I don't think the framers of the Reconstruction Amendments would have imagined a future court interpreting those two provisions of the Constitution, the 14th and 15th Amendments, to yield the kind of decision that the court offered last week. As you say, this now requires, in order to establish a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which was passed under the enforcement power of both the 14th and 15th Amendments, it requires a showing of intentional discrimination. That's really hard to do for all of the reasons Michael has suggested. You can simply say, it wasn't intentional racial discrimination. It was intentional partisan discrimination. I'm trying to stick it to Democrats. The problem, of course, and what the court does not acknowledge fully in its decision is that in the states in the South, and most of the states that are now rushing to redistrict are in the South and are states that were members of the Confederacy once upon a time, in the South, partisan affiliation and race are inextricably intertwined, which is to say that Democratic voters are often black voters in the South, and black voters are Democrats. So when you consolidate districts to achieve a partisan advantage and to stick it to Democrats, you're also sticking it to voters of color who are more likely to be Democrats. And you can't prove that under Section 2 because of this requirement now to establish intentional discrimination. Justice Alito, who wrote the majority opinion, did something that I think is just incredibly craven, which is to say that He said he was not eviscerating Section 2. He was merely preserving the central tenets. That is a lie. To the extent Section 2 survives, it only survives for this purpose. When California or some other blue state redistricts to consolidate partisan advantage or simply to create opportunity for voters to have their voices heard, Section 2 is going to be available for Republicans, non-white voters, whatever, to say there is intentional discrimination here. And I think that's the kind of intentional discrimination this court is going to recognize. So we will see Section 2 live to see another day, but it won't be for the purposes that Congress intended when they enacted it, and it won't be for the reasons of enforcing the tenets of the 15th and 14th Amendments.
And the 14th and 15th Amendments, notably, at the end of each of them says Congress has the power to enforce this. That was not just empty verbiage. They put that in there, and it had not been in earlier amendments because they did not trust the Supreme Court, which had just done the Dred Scott ruling.
They didn't trust,
the democratically
exactly.
elected branch needs to have the power to act here.
And this Supreme Court, I think, has steadily, over the course of 3 decades now, chipped away at Congress's power, certainly under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, also Section 2 of the 15th Amendment. Notably, interestingly, in Trump versus Anderson, that was the case about the insurrection clause of the 14th Amendment and whether individuals who had participated in insurrection against the United States could be disqualified from holding public office going forward. The court, in a rare moment of deference to Congress, said that that particular provision of the 14th Amendment could only be executed upon some sort of enactment of congressional legislation. It's the one piece of the 14th Amendment that the court has allowed Congress to actually enforce.
So, Article 2, as you said, President Trump has said, quote, Article 2 gives me the power to do anything I want as president. Has he read this book?
Why don't you just strike off this book? Has he read?
The framers were very worried about not just the King of England, but when you read the notes from Madison from the Constitutional Convention, it's quite an amazing thing. They said everything out loud. They saw a lot of what was going to happen in the country, and they were very worried, not just about a tyrant as they saw it like King George, but about Caesar and Cromwell and presidents who would be demagogues and a man of opulence and ambition at one point, as Madison warned, might take power. What do you...
Intemperate in his persona.
Intemperate in his persona, with all the gold toilet seats and everything. How is the reading of the Constitution wrong from those who want a unitary executive? In other words, a lot of the issues now that we're facing, the great issues at this moment in constitutional law, involve the power of the presidency and the power of the president over the executive branch and the power of the executive branch as the dominant branch in so many ways. And we're having this conversation when the big cases we're waiting for from the Supreme Court, many of them involve this very issue. And where do you see them going right and going wrong?
So in the Constitution, in Article 2, the president certainly has the power to appoint federal officers, and they can be members of administrative agencies, members of multi-member commissions that function as administrative agencies. It doesn't say anything about removal, right? And so there's this open question of whether the president has the power to remove them or whether there is some sort of shared authority with Congress that obviously has the authority to structure and delegate the power and authority to create those administrative agencies and maybe even to put limits on the executive's ability to remove those officers. There are 2 cases currently pending before the court right now. One involves the removal of Rebecca Slaughter, who was a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission. The other involves the president's attempted removal of Lisa Cook, who was a governor of the Federal Reserve. I think, and I'm willing to take bets on this, I'm pretty sure the court will overrule Humphrey's executor, which is a precedent from the 1930s dealing with FDR's attempt to remove Humphrey, who was a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission. The court in the 1930s said that Congress can impose limits on the president's ability to remove those kinds of officers, multi-member commissions. I think that will probably fall by the wayside. This is a court that has no problem with overruling precedents. In the 5 or so years that it's had a 6-3 conservative supermajority, it's overruled precedents in almost every one of those years. Dobbs, the affirmative action precedents, Chevron, on and on and on. I think this one will fall as well. I am not entirely sure that the president will succeed in his quest to remove Lisa Cook from the Federal Reserve. So, part of it is just the procedural posture of that case, right? Just the way it is. He hasn't removed her yet. The question is, will he be allowed to present, evidence of her wrongdoing, or whatever? Is there even evidence of her wrongdoing, or is the president unilaterally prevented from removing someone from that position? Based on what I saw at oral arguments, every one of these justices has a retirement account, and they deeply worry about the president's ability to mess with the Fed.
They did a shadow docket ruling, a ruling that said, basically, the rationale was, the Fed, it's just different.
The Fed is just different.
Alexander Hamilton, he had a bank, so therefore we're going to treat them differently. It's the level of analysis.
Honestly, I think everyone who brings claims before the Supreme Court, whether you are environmental advocates or people seeking reproductive rights, you need to frame all of your claims in terms of the economy. Like, mifepristone is important for the Federal Reserve and the economy. Climate change is about the economy. Like, literally, that's the only thing I think they care about.
That will save us, I'm sure. We have some tremendous questions from the audience. The first one of our questions is this. Do you think the Constitution was built to withstand this current moment in history, or do we need, as many have urged, another convention?
Is this Constitution battle-tested? Well, I think it was always intended to be updated and amended. I think that's why they have the mechanism for amendment in it. I think what they didn't count on was just how hard it would become to amend the Constitution. And that's not just because Article 5 already sets up a lot of bars, like supermajority votes required for amending the Constitution. It's also because now we have an enormously distorted electoral landscape. So if you have to go and get a supermajority of state legislatures to ratify something now, and most of those state legislatures are gerrymandered in one way or the other, it's going to be even harder than it's supposed to be. And I don't think they were expecting that, the kind of factionalism that has literally transformed the nature of our politics. And I think it is that kind of factionalism that's going to make it hard to have a constitutional convention, even if you wanted to have one. Elie Mystal, who I think is a brilliant theorist of the Constitution and a great public commentator about constitutional law issues, thinks that we should have a constitutional amendment, or a constitutional convention, just scrap it and start over, and start with the idea that we are going to write a document for a multiracial, multi-faith, modern democracy. I don't know if we can even do that given the kind of distortion. Like, the only way I think we can actually overcome the distortion is literally to have so much voter turnout that you counteract the distortion, and then you're able to actually do some of these things, first in Congress and then later through the state legislatures.
This is why so much of the constitutional change has happened through judge-made law. Yeah. When Franklin Roosevelt was facing the Supreme Court in the 1930s, striking down the New Deal and about to strike down Social Security and the labor laws, the idea that was the main idea was he should do a constitutional amendment, and he said all that has to happen is 13 houses of state legislatures, all they have to do is do nothing, and it can't pass. So it was very hard. But at the same time, we need to stretch our constitutional imagination as well. It always seems impossible to amend the Constitution until then.
Until it isn't. I mean, like, the last story in the book is about the 27th Amendment, which is the story of a college student named Greg Watson, who was doing a research paper at the University of Texas at Austin and discovered that When the Bill of Rights was first proposed, it was actually 12 amendments. Only 10 of them got ratified, and so there are these two just sort of lingering. One of them is an amendment that would have prohibited Congress from raising its compensation during a term in which they were still serving. So you have to wait until the next term in order for your pay to go up if you were in Congress. And he wrote this term paper about this lost amendment that never was ratified. He got a C on the paper. And he was undeterred, undaunted. Greg Watson just took this as an opening bid from the University of Texas, and he called a senator in Maine and was like, how do I get this amendment passed? Let me dream big. And the senator from Maine put him in touch with a bunch of state legislatures, and he went to work. And in 1992, on the heels of a congressional scandal involving check kiting, he succeeds in getting a supermajority of state legislatures over the line to pass the compensation amendment over 200 years after it was first proposed. And not only did he change the Constitution, the University of Texas at Austin changed his grade. He got an A. We can do this. We can do this.
I wish I had had that story to tell my parents at various points in my childhood. If you're a member of this new constitutional convention, what would you change?
The Electoral College is the most distortive, elitist, anti-democratic feature in our Constitution. That should go. Let's start there. There's more.
What would be your number two?
I think we should have an equal rights amendment. I think we should have campaign finance. An unsung hero of constitutional law that we never talk about, I know you talk about him at the Brennan Center, is Birch Bayh, who is responsible for most of the amendments that we've had in the 20th century. The 25th Amendment, if a president becomes incapacitated, that is Birch Bayh. Another terrific story about the 25th Amendment, when Birch Bayh was pushing this through the Congress, there was one naysayer from Tennessee, and that was Tennessee Senator Albert Gore Sr., who desperately worried that a very ambitious vice president might somehow deem the president incapacitated so he could seize power. And it was like, oh my God, did Al Gore's dad have a crystal ball? Did he know? He wasn't talking about that. But they addressed that in the 25th Amendment, putting some provisions to ensure that the vice president couldn't effectively have a coup.
And to remind us that this is not ancient history, the young lawyer who worked with Birch Bayh is John Feerick, who was the dean of Fordham Law School and still teaches at Fordham Law School in New York today. The lifespan of this country is much shorter than we realize, and when you think about it that way. Do you think the Constitution, this question asks, and again, these are tremendous, do you think it's still relevant in dealing with new issues like AI and social media?
So, I love this question. We it's not just AI and social media. We could talk about this in the context of gun rights. Obviously, the current Supreme Court, at least in the context of the Second Amendment, thinks it's perfectly fine. If you have a law prohibiting the use of guns at a summer camp or the possession of a gun at a summer camp, the only question you need to ask is, did James Madison go to summer camp? Right? That's the main question.
A judge in upstate New York said, I
Yes.
could find history and tradition. We need to follow history and tradition. Two examples from the colonial era is not a tradition. That's just two examples. You need three. And I can find no evidence of summer camps in the colonial era, so you can't ban guns from summer camps.
I don't want to make more of this. I think the whole originalist project is bunk. I do. I don't say that in the book. I'll let you come to your own conclusions about what you think of originalism. But I do think the whole idea of analogical legal reasoning means that we can still use this document because we can still reason, right? So in Fourth Amendment cases where we're trying to think about geofencing, which is something that the court took up just last week, we don't need to know whether James Madison had a cell phone and a geofence. We can't think about what is the spirit of the Fourth Amendment, what is it trying to get at? And how do we think about modernity in the context of those basic principles? Like, that's the whole Anglo-American legal tradition, like just reasoning by analogy, like literally thinking. And I think we can do that. I would like to think we can do that.
Does Claude have the right to free speech?
The 14th Amendment already started this by saying corporations were persons for purposes of the 14th Amendment. So
The court said the 14th Amendment said that.
well, the court said the 14th Amendment had that. No one said no. And now, it's so funny, though, the court is so dismissive of the 14th Amendment, given that so many emotional support billionaires are the CEOs of these corporations that have personhood under the 14th Amendment. But yes, Claude is, I think, already a person for purposes of the 14th Amendment, or perhaps Claude is a person.
Claude will be happy to hear that. That's not a hallucination.
I love that you're being nice to Claude, because you know when your robot overlords come, you want to be in good shape.
I, for one, welcome them.
They'll know. You're throwing me under the bus with the overlords.
You wrote this book during an interesting time to write about constitutional law and everything that's going on. Are there things, as you dove back into the paragraphs and sentences, are there things that surprised you?
I think one of the hardest parts of this book, and the team from Simon & Schuster is here, so they know this so intimately, is when were we just putting the pen down? It was like, but they took Nicolas Maduro today. I got to write about that. And but I mean, it was just like everything happening all at once. I mean, it was an act of will and restraint on my part to literally put the pen down, because I could have kept going. I really could have. Like, what does this mean? What does this mean? How do we think about what is happening right now in this context with regard to the Constitution? But that's, I think, a testament to how important it is to be engaged with the Constitution right now, to read the Constitution, to understand it, because every single day I look around, I'm like, I don't think that's okay under the Constitution. I mean, I genuinely have these moments where I'm like, I think that's unconstitutional. I don't think you can do that.
Your previous book, a #1 New York Times bestseller, perhaps only your first, was an annotated look at the indictment of President Trump.
All 4 of them, and thank you to the Supreme Court for making it a work of science fiction.
Where do you rank the Trump versus United States case, which was the case that found vast and previously unknown immunity from criminal law for the president and former presidents? Where do you rank that among the major cases in our history?
That's got to be at the top of the list. Our podcast, Strict Scrutiny, we are about to embark on what we call the bad decisions tour, because the court's like, let's make some bad decisions, and we're going to talk about them. On the back of our tour T-shirt, we literally have just a list of bad decisions that the court has issued. So, Shelby County versus Holder, Dobbs is on there, Loper Bright, and Trump versus United States is #1 with a bullet. It's a really bad decision. And it's not just bad in terms of its substance, it's also bad and deeply, deeply cynical in just how the court did it. So today, for example, there was something of a spat between Justices Alito and Jackson at the court over the court's decision to basically depart from its usual practice of waiting 32 days before implementing a decision. This is in the Louisiana versus Calais case. There are elections going on right now in Louisiana, and the voters who prevailed in that case have asked the court to depart from that 32-day delay in order to allow the decision to be implemented right now so that it can impact the current primary that will obviously have implications for the midterm elections. And the court, with a stunning degree of alacrity, has acceded to that request. Compare that to when Trump versus United States came before the court, how they dithered and dithered and dithered about granting cert. That case was presented to them in February. And they dithered and they dithered and they dithered, and then they deigned to set it for oral argument on the very last day of the April calendar. And then they dithered, and they dithered, and they dithered, and they issued a decision in early July, making it impossible for those cases to go forward and setting a precedent that I think effectively overruled United States versus Nixon, a number of different presidents reining in the president.
The explicit language of the Constitution, which talks about how you can prosecute a president after impeachment, how impeachment doesn't affect that.
Right.
And you mentioned United States versus Nixon. All the other major cases, the really big cases dealing with the power of the president and accountability for the president, United States versus Nixon, Paula Jones versus Clinton, and the Steele case, Youngstown, were unanimous. They worked really hard to make it unanimous because they understood how important it was. According to the journalism in the New York Times, there could have been a unanimous ruling saying there are limits on the ability to prosecute a president. I have some sympathy for that idea, but not in this case, not when you try to overthrow the election. And instead, John Roberts chose to lead the 6-car conservative, hyper-conservative parade rather than having a unanimous ruling. I mean, it really, each time I read that decision, my blood pressure goes up a little bit. One last question. For law students who are here, for the law students in your classes, for people entering the legal profession who are wondering about the Constitution and how real it is, how seriously they should take it, how seriously they should take all the rules of interpretation that we teach, that you teach. What do you say to people entering the legal profession?
So I understand the cynicism. Students are really jaded right now. It's a tough time to be a law student. It's a tough time to be a law professor. Every year the syllabus changes. Every year during the period when you should be grading exams, you're sort of waiting on tenterhooks to see what case has been overruled. That's not normal, right? Those are not normal things that happen. And I understand why students are cynical and why they think the court is just all politics at this point. And because it's probably true. It's a lot of politics right now. It doesn't have to be that way, right? And I think that's the part that I emphasize for my students. The court has always been somewhat regressive as an institution. The Warren Court, which we venerate, is really a blip. That's not normal. That was the aberration. The court being regressive for the most part is where the court has always been. The real problem has been the way the other institutions have either become more maximalist in their understanding of their authority as facilitated by the court, or have shrunk in their ability to jealously guard their prerogatives. We have a court that is maximalist to some degree, and in doing so is a midwife to an administration that is offering the most muscular vision of executive authority that we've probably ever seen. And we have a Congress that's not doing much of anything, right? I joke on the Strict Scrutiny podcast, like, what is a Congress? Can I get that on my Target run? What do I do about that? We can change that, right? There's Congress is elected, and I know it sounds so Pollyannish just to say to vote, but I mean this. Like, a third of the electorate sat out the 2024 election. What if we all came out? What if we all took this so seriously that we came out in every election, not just the big ones, the in-between ones, the ones for local office? I mean, why are we leaving power on the table? There's power in every quarter here, the local level, the school boards. Why are we sleeping on that power? And that's the work for my students. Like, many students, and I was one of them, you go to law school in New York City, you get seduced by the bright lights and you want to stay here. Or you can go back home to Oregon or Montana, wherever you are, Florida, and you can do something in your hometown that makes this better, because every one of those small changes ultimately in the aggregate adds up. Like, we have to believe that. It's literally the only thing that saved us before. The Reconstruction era, people thinking about small changes that collectively can lead to something bigger. The populist era, small changes that together galvanize public support for something different, something better, something more responsive to the people. And I think at bottom, we have to begin with the text, and the beginning of this text starts with we, the people. And we need to remember that.
Professor Melissa Murray, thank you for this really tremendous book. Thank you for teaching us. Thank you for being here, and thank you for everything you do. We're so grateful.
Thank you to the Brennan Center. I appreciate this.
And this is where I quake, because Melissa is a podcast pro and I am a wannabe. But at this moment, I want to say, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe at the places where and the platforms where you subscribe to podcasts. If you liked it, please give us 5 stars. And above all else, tell your friends and communities about the briefing. It's important that we all be part of the community of understanding our democracy and our Constitution at a time like this.
Can I do it?
Please do.
If you've enjoyed this episode of The Briefing, please subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're so inclined, please give us a 5-star rating. It really helps.